Welcome to the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast, GCC edition. I'm your host, Nick Lal, and this is a special series coming out of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast focused on one of the most exciting regions in the emerging world right now. And I am here today with our guest, Waleed AlBanawi. Waleed is an INSEAD 05D and executive chairman and CEO at Banvest Group. He is also an entrepreneur in residence at INSEAD, and he's been the executive chairman at JISR Venture Partners, which was one of the first investment companies in the GCC region. He helped start it way back in 2013. He served 26 years at Banawi Industrial Group, which I definitely want to get into it as well. And he has also been chairman of YPO for the MENA region. And so we're just getting this podcast started, had a few episodes, and we wanted to get as good insights on the region as possible. And having someone like Walid in is something that I feel extremely lucky about. He's one of the top people in the region on so many different issues. Traditional business is tech, and he's pretty much a font of information on anything in the region. And so what I think is really interesting about your background, though, is that you and your family were traditional entrepreneurs in Saudi at a time when that was not so common. I mean, of course, there's a lot of money in the region and in that part of the world, and it mostly came from a commodity that we're all well aware of, whereas your family started an industrial group that had nothing to do with that. And so I think a place that could be really interesting for me to start is just learning more about that journey, your father's journey. He was a self-made man and true entrepreneur in Saudi Arabia at a time when that path was really not common. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit about your father's journey. What are some of the hardships he faced along the way, and any lessons that you took away from his life, and how you designed an approach to entrepreneurship and business yourself from those learnings?
Thank you, Nick. Well, pleasure to join your podcast. My father was a pioneer, established the first paper packaging business in the kingdom, folding cartons and later corrugated cartons. This is, again, Saudi Arabia pre-oil boom. So you can imagine how things must have been. Clearly, when I look back at those years, I think he chose the road less traveled. Most Jeddah merchants or merchant families at the time were in one way or another involved in trading activities. He picked industry. One, access to capital wasn't easy. There were a handful of banks at the time, and only a few would lend an industrial venture. It was very apparent that manufacturing business was deemed risky versus a general trading activity or real estate for that matter. Interestingly, he had a mentor who believed in him and who lent him a few 100,000 riyals, which was then a lot of money. So again, surprisingly, one would think, well, entrepreneurship may have not existed back then in the early 60s, but it was, in a way, that the ecosystem was alive, albeit still very nascent. More importantly, he needed skilled factory operators to run what was then a very costly printing and converting equipment. So imagine he managed to entice master printers from Germany. We're talking here late 60s. So to join and to train the local staff. The regulatory environment was also different then from now. Running a business then was a constant struggle, maybe exciting and financially rewarding, envisaging that he had the market to himself at the time, being a pioneer. Well, in the years that followed, he expanded the business to become the predominant market leader in packaging until the next generation took over and further diversified the business activities regionally, but also adding new business segments like specialty chemicals.
Yeah, that's really pretty incredible to do that at a time when I don't think there was much like that going on in Saudi or a lot of emerging market countries in that part of the world at that time. Being able to convince someone to give you that money is really quite impressive, I think, when there wasn't established bank lending and all of that make things so much easier these days. What ways do you think that experience of your father impacted your own resilience in business and life? Are there any major learnings from his success that you've modeled your own path afterward?
Yes, good question, Nick. My father was a self-made man, as you've mentioned, and extremely humble. He was a very hardworking and tenacious person. So his life was about facing constant headwinds, while clearly, like any businessman, looking for those tailwinds to propel your business forward. So in a way, he would always tell us that every cloud had a silver lining and to always see opportunity in any problem or challenge. I went to boarding school in the middle 70s. So in a way, we didn't have the means of communication of today. It was manual circuit connection to dial home, if you know what I mean. So I had to also learn how to deal with adversity from age 12. It was fight or flight throughout my childhood years. So there's a lot to have learned from his journey in a way a bit less complex maybe, but it was not easy. I was an avid athlete and also competed in sports. Being engaged in competitive sports helped me a lot later in my career, but also those high school adverse experiences helped me navigate and deal with many challenges later in life. For example, moving from one country to another at an early age, adapting to new cultures and languages helped me build resilience. And by the way, they never teach you that in business school. So it's, as they say, you fly on your own and you go through that experience and journey by building that resilience.
Definitely. I think that's pretty common thing among people who've lived overseas, had to live away from family when they're young, live in different countries. It's common in a lot of INSEAD alumni, actually, is that they had that kind of upbringing. And you're right. I think that is what built a lot more of their resilience in life than whatever they might have learned in business school. And also on the sport point, we actually just had another podcast with a guy who was responsible for the World Cup in Qatar. And he talked a lot about how sports impacted his life growing up. And so it's interesting to see that theme keep coming up. So you've had a lot of success, not just in the manufacturing world that you grew up, you actually were a leader in venture capital in the GCC. So I was curious, at what point did you decide that that was an area that you wanted to pursue? And what were the reasons that you realized that it was an area where there could be success to be had in the region?
Well, funny enough, I had served my tenure, so to speak, in manufacturing after spending almost 26 years in the family business. And to be honest, it wasn't run in any way like a family business. We've always differentiated the family from the business. So we had independent board members, and actually out of a total of 7, only 2 came from share owners. And we had 5 independent board members who were selected from various industries. And we were at the time a closed joint stock, so almost ready to go for an IPO. So we had developed strong corporate governance practices, and a solid management team, I must say, was in place. So transitioning out was managed fairly smoothly, I would say. At that time, it was quite interesting. I mean, I was kind of looking for a change of pace. It's not easy. Some people just fester and stay where they were. I mean, I felt as a successful businessman, I wanted to support the next generation of entrepreneurs in the region, capitalizing on my skill set and experience in managing growth in a fairly competitive business. So I thought those skill sets could be used in helping tech entrepreneurs. So equally, investing in tech was becoming very relevant, as you can imagine, in 2013, 14 onwards. And MENA was kind of a focal point of investment looking from the global landscape. So I felt this quite interesting time to back disruptive companies. I mean, this is the time when Kareem had just started amongst other leading tech startups. So yes, it was not easy at the end, but I think because you need to learn fundamentally the startup language, the ecosystem is totally different than being in a manufacturing company, but you humble yourself. And I did. First investment I made was in edtech, education technology, and I traveled to the US on numerous occasions to understand what makes that industry tick, what are the disruptors, et cetera, et cetera.
Definitely. I think that, first of all, edtech has been a great industry, especially in emerging market countries around the world. But I think that's the great approach, is to see what is working in the US, apply that to local market dynamics, and use the knowledge that you have of the local market to build a leader. Now that Rocket Internet has been really successful doing that, for example. You mentioned that part of it was also to help out the entrepreneurs in the region, as it was pretty nascent at that time. And you have a lot of experience in the region. I mean, your father took risks that people at that time weren't taking. And of course, as we know, that startups and VC are very risky. There's some investments that may return the whole portfolio, but then there are a lot of other ones that are going to fail. And so I was curious what common ways you see that entrepreneurs have failed in the GCC. I'm sure there are unique challenges there that are different from other places. So I was wondering if you could talk about some of those and how you'd recommend entrepreneurs prepare for the specific challenges that they might face in the GCC region.
Yes, that's a very, very good question, Nick. Unfortunately, many entrepreneurs fail to look beyond their go-to-market strategy. I mean, I wouldn't say many, but there are like at least the most of the ones that I've come across that were in industries that they have not actually worked in. Many entrepreneurs, as you know, get to work in industries because they happen to find opportunities in those sectors. But in most situations, the startup journey evolves to a point where the initial product market fit could change midway. And particularly with the constantly changing consumer trends. So a lot of tech entrepreneurs who haven't worked in business don't realize that this is actually what does happen, albeit in a traditional business, your market segment is more, mature and known. But in a tech situation, that's not the case. So a key essential skill for an entrepreneur is to have the wit to pivot and adapt quickly while burning as little capital. I honestly believe the term burn rate is disrespectful to capital. And I used to say it at conferences and events. I say, please, can you use terms that are more, friendly to share owners? So, I mean, everyone reckons significant amount of money is often required to launch a business or, let's say, gain critical momentum in a marketplace. And I've seen that. But it's important that that should not come at the expense of shareholders, like burning so much capital at an early stage. I've had two situations where this has been the case. And unfortunately, those startups have not done well later, Series B and onwards. I mean, it's simple. Sometimes you don't need all these fancy offices. I know sometimes it's popular where you come into a place, whether it's here in the region or even elsewhere. One has to pay attention to high rents. When you're bootstrapping the business, you don't need to follow the footsteps of WeWork. Most great startups grew up in a garage. So it's those things that I think are always important to recognize. Also, I've always advocated instilling the basics of governance in every startup company I invested or joined their board. Hasn't been easy, but I continue to do it until this minute. It's a constant battle because, to be honest, some VCs here are short-sighted and greedy. I sit across the board with some of the venture capital, and many never really ran real businesses. To appreciate the role effective boards can play, even in a startup, they think, why do you need a board? Well, it's important to have that separation of duties to give guidance and to lend oversight actually to management.
Definitely agree on all accounts. Pivoting is definitely an essential need for startups and VC. And I think that is what separates it from investing in other types of businesses that you may not have the product market fit at the beginning, but as long as the founder and the company is capable of pivoting, then you do have a chance of still being successful. And I think you're right in terms of governance as well. People talk a lot about how big corporates can learn from startups and they can become more nimble, but the reverse is also true, that the startup world could benefit from a lot of the governance that more established businesses have, and that could save them in the long run when they run into some issues that startups don't handle so well. Given that you don't necessarily invest in product market fit because, again, as you said, things may change, I was wondering what criteria you use to evaluate businesses, startups, founders when you do invest in them.
I often start by looking at the sector and assess the future growth opportunities in that sector. I also, frankly, dissect the business model, the value propositions, and the company's ability to scale. I also focus on the company's path to profitability. This had been an area of greatest concern, particularly in the MENA region. When capital is widely available, that's normally easier. But I think this glory of VC funding party, so-called spray and pray, is over. So you really need to get people to understand that, look, when you build a business, you need to show me a path to profitability. It doesn't have to be year one, year two. But it can be this thing that I've just mentioned earlier, this burn rate and run rate. So I put a lot of emphasis on that element. Again, I come from the corporate world where performance is reality. So performance is the bottom line, it's delivering net profit. More important, I also put great emphasis on the organization. Any company that has too much power and concentration in the founder, who may happen to be also the CFO, CTO, or CMO, Chief Marketing Officer, is most likely to fail. And I've been privy to that experience, unfortunately. A strong founder CEO will build an effective organization and a team that can manage the growth at every stage of the company. So again, it boils down to their past experiences. I did mention this earlier. I mean, if you haven't been a great leader somewhere else or an effective manager, not having built, let's say, complex, profitable companies, you're not likely to succeed. It's very simple. And this is really something that has actually been talked about now, even in Silicon Valley. People are valuing executives who have come from tech or even outside, but have built experience in managing companies and not simply coming out of college, having short tenure in a company or a consulting company, and then moving to setting up your venture.
Sure. I think that's definitely a good way to approach things. You mentioned WeWork earlier, and some of the issues there were the concentration of power at the top. And I think it's also a given that the person who might have the idea and can take the coming from 0 to 1, they're often not someone who has the experience to keep growing it. So absolutely an important area to look. Shifting gears a little bit, I know that you've talked about the skills gap in MENA, and it is one of the younger regions in the world with a huge youth population. So was curious if you have any thoughts on what future employment may look like for that large youth population, and also what sort of education you think is necessary to set them up for success in the future.
Excellent question, really. I mean, as a business leader from the Gulf region, the education for employment gap or challenge, I would say, has been an area personally of great passion and effort for me. And I'll explain why. I mean, during my experience in industry, I have led several nonprofits which aim to provide a variety of solutions and innovative ideas for delivering 21st century skills and career readiness. Programs like Journey to Achievement, Education for Employment, where I've been part of their Middle East expansion. Main characteristics, I would say, of those unemployed, if we look at the Middle East, North Africa, is that there's a mismatch between jobs and skills. And this applies to the GC probably to a lesser extent, but fundamentally the Middle East, North Africa has been plagued by this typical, college graduates, but doesn't have the skill set to work in a private sector. And my motto has been all along that you don't need a college degree for jobs that don't require them. So what we need more in the GCC, for example, is competency-based education, i.e. building core competencies and soft skills that employers are looking for, and not just a college degree that doesn't really guarantee you a job. In the US specifically, there's been a big movement around competency-based learning and education. And I'll give you an example. Think of data science like an extended bootcamp that guarantees a graduate a job in a fintech company, or cybersecurity, or for that matter, digital marketing, or even as simple as a coffee barista certification program. I mean, the region is booming, and in all sorts of F&B and hospitality. So you can get a lot of unemployed into what I call customized training, addressing those unemployed through customized training. So yes, I believe we need to continue to invest in human talent development in the GCC, particularly in those areas of vocational workforce readiness skills programs, including competency-based learning. More importantly, I think it starts in K-12 in schools. We need to start teaching, I know it's happening in some countries, even in Saudi, teaching them financial literacy skills in schools, which helps youth grasp the basics of budgeting and investing. Ultimately, this strengthens the entrepreneurial skills in young adults early on in life. And I think if you capture the development part, then you're building a very strong chain of entrepreneurs. And we've seen that in many developed countries. So yes, that in my opinion is one way to address the skills gap.
I think that's definitely a very good way to approach it. And that is very needed everywhere in the world. I think even in the US, we need more of that, where the traditional education channels aren't really preparing people for the workforce anymore. And whether it's high tech or low tech, blue collar jobs, there aren't enough people that have the skills that need to do those. And so there are more programs popping up now, but it is still very, very needed, I think, all over the world. So completely agree with that, and also agree with the point that entrepreneurship can solve unemployment. The more new businesses there are, the more jobs there will be for people. Speaking to that last point on entrepreneurship, I was wondering if you could talk more about how you see entrepreneurship evolving in the coming years. I know Saudi Arabia And a lot of the countries in the region are trying to diversify away from oil and bring in new industries. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on if there are any specific industries in the region that are especially promising for new ventures.
Yeah, I mean, under Vision 2030, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has made very bold and transformative moves, which really marked a new era for the country. Anyone like myself who worked in industry before and has seen how these urgent reforms were initiated, mainly to remodel the economy, which have been tackled through this National Transformation Program. You can imagine it covered a wide range of themes, objectives, with the main aim at diversifying the economic income away from oil, in a way enabling the private sector and private enterprises to flourish. Also, a key component of this program focused on on achieving the government excellence, so mainly accelerating the kingdom's digital transformation. I'll give you an example. I mean, issuing an online commercial license today is done in a few minutes, all the way to attending, let's say, court sessions virtually. This was unheard of before, including other government AI services that have been streamlined and now managed through an app. You could basically conduct any sort of government transaction online, whether private or business. Regarding your other question, in my opinion, one of the most promising sectors, I believe, is fintech, and probably coming soon would be health tech. For example, I mean, I don't know if you're aware of Tamara, which is a shop and pay later, is a unicorn fintech today, very successful company. There are other leading fintech companies like Clean Technologies, STC Pay, amongst others. But this specific sector is really thriving. And again, you have to imagine the population the kingdom have and the age, the youth. You have 70% of the population under the age of 30. So anything within that sector of fintech is going to prosper. I would also think the entertainment and tourism, and I'd include hospitality, are promising sectors too. I would envision there would be many opportunities for scalable startups in this sector. You could see it. I mean, today Saudi Arabia is hosting so many international events, including its tourism sector. From east to west and all the way north to south, you have beautiful sites to visit. So you can imagine that many opportunities would exist in those sectors that would be probably deemed very, very successful over the long term.
Definitely. I think that it's probably going to become one of the most exciting tourism destinations soon, because it is a part of the world that a lot of people don't know a lot, but it has a lot to offer, and a lot of travelers seeking a more authentic travel experience, but also one filled with modernity. Should be really excited to be able to visit Saudi Arabia in the near future. And to your earlier point on some of the initiatives that the government set up, I think that we've seen that in countries like Estonia or maybe Singapore, where when the government was very innovative and incorporated technology, digitized a lot of services, that really did spur entrepreneurship. And so it's going to be really exciting to see where that goes in a country as large as Saudi Arabia. On that point, I'd love to hear your thoughts on how government policies are impacting entrepreneurship in the region, if there are specific initiatives or reforms that you think could most accelerate innovation and growth in the region, and if there are any that are not there that you think should be implemented as well.
I mean, across the board, GCC governments reckon how entrepreneurship could accelerate their diversification plans from oil. So, I mean, whether it's the UAE or Saudi Arabia, even Kuwait, across the board, it's very obvious. This leads to economic development and job creation. There's no question asked. And so far of Saudi, plenty to be honest. I mean, some of the policies like the SME Authority has been really busy spearheading several initiatives and providing holistic solutions and services to support entrepreneurs and SME owners, such as mentoring programs, training services, links to incubators and accelerators. And again, they work in tandem with other ministries. It's the Ministry of Communications and Information Technology, which has also affiliates such as the National Technology and Development Program, which actually does provide some lending to companies starting up in Saudi and foreign tech startups. So again, you have the Ministry of Investment, clearly, that is also involved because they're aiming to entice foreign investment in all forms of tech and non-tech, including various other lending institutions like the SME Bank, the Social Development Bank, amongst others.
Definitely. As you've noted, and I've seen with a lot of your investments, there is also the social impact aspect of entrepreneurship, and that it does solve needs in a society, it provides employment, et cetera. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what social impact means to you, and Is that part of your investment criteria? How do you balance that?
It's a good question. It is part of what I normally look at, but the business is maybe nascent still. I mean, the social impact element of it in the region. But it's also important to highlight that social impact is vital for business everywhere and has been an important topic for governments and companies here in the region. Building a business focusing only on social good aspect is unsustainable. That's the school that I come from. As you can imagine, profit is essential to grow an economy and to create wealth necessary for a society to prosper. Because people get carried away with this aspect of social impact. You need to deliver returns ultimately to share owners. I mean, we've seen several government initiatives in the region, particularly really in the area of climate change and renewable energy. For example, central to the Vision 2030, Saudi Arabia's pledge to reach net zero emissions by 2060. Also, the kingdom has made several ambitious plans to reduce carbon emissions to accelerate the transition to a green economy. Again, this has been happening in the last few years, so we need to give time for these initiatives to impact ultimately. I mean, there are other initiatives that also are being played out, including, I'm aware of 8.4 billion green hydrogen plant in NEO, which is said to be the world's largest. And there is a lot of focus amongst governments here, as you can imagine, around the green energy. And that, I think, is going to continue to be a key focal area.
Definitely, yeah. I think that, again, you're seeing really state-of-the-art stuff happening in that part of the world, whether it's just technology that's making the economy more attractive for investment, or you're really working on solving societal needs. There's just so much innovation and capital going into solutions of all types. And so it is making a really exciting part of the world to be in right now. Just one last question as we are running up on time. I'd love to hear if you have any advice for the younger generation. I mean, you've had such an illustrious career across not only traditional business, but also VC in the region. Do you have one piece of advice that you'd give to young entrepreneurs in the GCC?
I've always, demanded a lot from myself. I mean, this has been my ethos, and therefore from others that I've had the opportunity to manage. I would encourage really the young generation to raise the performance bar and stay out of the comfort zone mindset. This expands personal growth. This is very, very, very important. So, 2-3 points that I think are also important. Build a lifelong learning mindset. This also leads to personal growth and development that extends far beyond the confines of formal education. It's important to foster a love for learning new skills. And I think this has been an area where I humbly have benefited a lot. As I transitioned out of manufacturing, I've had to humble myself and learn new skills, new technologies, new aspects that drove the whole tech startup ecosystem. More important, develop and innovate rather than renovate mindset. What do I mean by that? Be open to new ideas, perspectives, and experiences. And innovate is kind of a more substantive about accepting change. Sometimes it's that disruption that leads you to have to change the whole structure versus renovating and changing the furniture. Finally, I think it was Jeff Bezos who once said, in the end, we are our choices. Build yourself a great story. Those would be my parting words of advice for the young generation.
Amazing advice. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Nick.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the INSEAD Emerging Markets Podcast. To stay up to date on events we may be hosting, emerging market news, and to build your personal network, please feel free to join the INSEAD Alumni Emerging Markets Interest Group on LinkedIn.